Okay, thank you. My name is Frank van Oort. I'm from Erasmus University Rotterdam in the Netherlands, and I'm chairing this session, keeping everyone to its 10 minutes. I still hope we have an hour, but let's see how far we can get. 4 people other than me on the table. Professor Philip McCann from Sheffield University, he will start off. He's one of the main researchers in this project. Charlie Hopkirk, productivity and skills experts. I'm really interested in it to see. Mrs. Nicola Ewart, West Midlands Growth Company, and David Hearn from Birmingham City University and Centre of Brexit Studies. So I will give the floor to Philip McCann, and if I start to do a bit nervous, then your 10 minutes are about to finish. Okay.
So what I'm going to do is just give you an overview. So we're a large team, as Raquel has already explained. Different members of our team from different countries are here. So this is a very large, this part of our research that we're doing is a very large data-based analysis. It's not taking national statistics or anything and trying to interpret them. It's actually data building exercise. It's been an enormous exercise. And we worked out it's about 20 person years of data building, approximately, to do what we've done. So this is a very large effort, which is based on previous data building exercises that we as a team have been working on in other projects as well, nothing to do with Brexit. So it predates that, but then we've been updating these data. It's a very large data sets. So the work we've done that I'm going to highlight today is already published. You can download. These are gold open access, so you can download all these research reports for free via the project website that Raquel already mentioned. And we have more research which is ongoing using data in different ways. Frank van Oort will explain something later. We have some other work with Bart Loss, who's not able to be here today. So this is ongoing. So these are some of the papers already published. What's the issue? The issue is this. When we think about trade, the kind of things that you hear in the press, we export services. The French sell us wine, the Italians sell us Prosecco. These are common narratives in policy debates and in the media debates. But trade doesn't work like that. So if I take the case, if I'm talking to my own students, the example I always use is the West Midlands. How does it work? A small engineering company in West Midlands will get a contract from Jaguar Land Rover or Toyota. What do? They get a 5-year deal. They go to the bank, which is a local supplier of finance, who's worked with those engineering companies for decades and generations. They know the backbone and the detail of those businesses. That's where the negotiations come in. Local lawyers from specialized in the auto industry then come into the discussions as well. And they're also working with IT specialists and specialists on intellectual property in the West Midlands technical engineering arena. So you've got manufacturing and services all coming together straight away at the local level. They don't go to the financial markets in London to get business unless you're Jaguar Land Rover. Small suppliers don't do that. They work locally. But then what happens? They produce a component which is then sent to Italy on a joint venture. Research and development inputs are added in Italy, which then goes to a consortium in France. France, what they do is they add value to the joint venture. The goods already come back to a company in Germany. They're embodied in a sub-assembly, which are then sent to the UK. They're advanced, the sub-assemblies in the UK supply chain, which is classic Birmingham. They go back to the Netherlands, they go back to Germany, they come back to the UK. They're embodied in an automobile, which is then exported back to Denmark and Sweden. That's how trade works. They're called global value chains. And the point about this is you cannot say anything about the impacts of trade on an economy by looking at exports and imports. All this trade surplus, trade deficit stuff, in economics terms, is complete nonsense. It's based on a logic called mercantilism, which basically disappeared with the Corn Law debates in the middle of the 19th century. There's no economics course anywhere in the world that teaches mercantilism. These are political narratives. To understand the effects, you've got to understand all those value chains crisscrossing borders multiple times. And it's not just within an industry, it's between industries and between sectors, within countries and between countries. You've got to be able to construct data to explain that kind of process that I've just explained, a typical process in a West Midlands engineering company. And so you have to construct these data that allows this. And our project has been working on constructing these data sets. All of this is published. It's based on what's called the World Impact Output Database, which is all the trade and internal industrial structure data of 85% of the global economy. Inside that, we have all these trade flows within sectors and between sectors, within countries and between countries, across 245 NUTS 2 regions in Europe. So you're looking at about 14 million data points for each year. We've got 10 years of data. And the data's all free. You can download it. It's just gigabytes and gigabytes. But basically what happens is you can start to use the data to tell the story of what is called value added in exports. You cannot say anything using trade surplus, trade deficit arguments. They're largely meaningless. You have to understand what is the value added in exports. So think about that value chain explanation I've just given you. How does that work? So when we have changes in trade structures, exports and imports on both sides, because value chains go forwards and backwards, you're re-importing things that you previously exported, and you're exporting things that you previously re-imported. These things are going back, forwards and backwards multiple times. You've got to be able to decompose all these things to work out what the value-added effect on the local economy is, and that's what our work does. Now, the way to do it, it's a technical argument, but it's called hypothetical extraction. What you do is you say, what does the economy look like today? So that's what the economy looks. We've got open borders and trades going through. You compare it. Imagine something goes, so you have the worst case Brexit scenario, just to hypothetically to start off with. So the collapse in negotiations at the last minute. So for 1 minute or 1 second or 1 day or 1 month or 1 year, trade stops. Okay, it's just analytically, this is what you have to do. You compare that scenario with the current scenario. The difference between the two actually is how you calculate value added in exports. This is a big analytical argument. It's in very famous journal articles in the American Economic Review, including members of our team who've published there. That is how you actually calculate. So you imagine the worst no Brexit, no deal scenario and compare it with today's case. That's actually analytically how you calculate the value added in exports. The important point about it is that is how you calculate the exposure of every region and industry to the effects of Brexit. So you can take the limit case is the no deal case, last minute, chaotic Brexit as Anand Menon would refer to, or you can take any more benign version of Brexit, customs union, customs partnership, single market, EFTA, it doesn't matter. You've got degrees of severity, but the point is you can calculate how exposed different regions are within the UK and also across the whole of Europe to whatever form of Brexit takes place. So that is what we do. And what we're not doing is we're not saying what is the impact. We're very careful. We're talking about what are the implications. What do we mean? The exposure that we calculate then tells us how much does a locality, a region, or an industry have to restructure in order to overcome the shocks related to Brexit. That's what you have to think about it. How much are you going to have to change what you do and how you do it in order to adapt, to adjust? Yep, that's what we do. And all of this is on the website, so I'm just going to go through all these slides you can see. This is what the results look like. So here is the UK. The UK's levels of exposure for all UK regions are higher than anywhere else in Europe, except the Republic of Ireland, whose exposure levels, whose exposure levels are 10% of GDP. The UK regions all have exposure levels between about 11% and 17% of gross domestic product, domestic economic activity. That's the levels of exposure. People think, well, is that a big number or a small number? The contraction associated with the global financial crisis in most industrialized countries was around 3%. That gives you a sense of the orders of magnitude. Okay, these are the numbers. The regions in Europe which are the most exposed to Brexit are the regions in the Midlands of the UK and in the north of England. The northern regions and the Midlands regions are more exposed than anywhere else in Europe to Brexit. Followed by the rest of the UK, the Remain voting regions in Scotland and London and the South East, our data suggests are the least most exposed places, and their exposure levels are similar to the Republic of Ireland. The rest of Europe's exposure levels are tiny in comparison. So let's take the UK out because the numbers are so high and look at the rest of Europe. What you see is Ireland is the most exposed, followed by the western and the southern regions in Germany. It's the supply chain argument. Where are all the components and services coming into places like the West Midlands or the northern industrial areas? Where are they coming from? They're coming from places like southern and western Germany, parts of the Netherlands, parts of Belgium. The rest of Europe, the next one down, sorry, I don't mean to, the next one down is France, which is only about 2% exposed. France as a whole, is exposure levels just over 2%. The Netherlands is around 4%. The Belgian region's about 3.5%. The German regions are about 5 or 6%. The rest of Europe, if you think about rules, voting rules in the Council, the rest of Europe, Nordic Europe, Central Europe and Southern Mediterranean Europe, all of those countries have exposure levels of less than 1% of their GDP. In other words, they're not exposed at all. If Brexit happens, there's really no trade effect on them. It's only tiny. Because of the structure of trade, there's big issues around migration, of course, on security and so on, but they're not economic arguments, that's the point. And we get basically the same results in terms of local labour income. When Raquel said that these things have been referred to in the Houses of Parliament, the House of Lords, Michael Heseltine's been referring to in the European Parliament, these issues have been raised. Financial Times, Le Monde, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, The Guardian, many, many publications, these are the data that they're talking about. And these are the numbers I've already given you. Again, all of this is on the website, you can get everything. The point from our point of view is the UK's exposure levels are 4.6 times higher than the rest of Europe. It's got nothing to do with trade surpluses or deficits. It's a non-argument within economics. Okay? It's because of the structure of these relationships. We can also explain the argument at the sectoral level. These are the sectoral risk exposure in terms of total numbers of jobs across the UK, industry by industry. So, of course, you've got ones that you would expect, you know, motor vehicles, for example. You've got wholesale trade. You've got ones that you would expect might be significantly affected. Financial services is one that you get a lot of conversations around the city, but the total number of people affected in terms of exposed to Brexit in the financial services industry is actually quite small. It's only about 8% of their own industry levels of exposure, and the total numbers are tiny in comparison to professional services, administrative support, professional services, intellectual property, legal services, architecture, activities auxiliary to financial services, and so on. These are all the kind of activities that take place in Birmingham, in the city centre. These are all hidden. Why? Because they're the people who supply the financial services and the legal services and the intellectual property services to the engineering companies who are exposed to Brexit, because everyone's integrated. And these businesses are huge in terms of the economy, and they have almost no political representation. They're not part of the discussions. So what we've got is, in terms of relative exposure, advanced manufacturing is one of the most exposed industries. Very, very high levels of exposure. 40 to 50% of employment and value added in advanced manufacturing industries is directly exposed to Brexit. So, of course, in the West Midlands, this is a big issue. But what people don't realise is the service industries in the West Midlands that lock into those supply chains are also extremely highly exposed. Many services are not exposed at all. Local real estate businesses, for example, there's no exposure. There's no exposure in terms of construction industries. But these kind of technical, advanced services plugging into these global supply chains are extremely exposed. And our calculations say it's about £140 billion a year in terms of direct exposure levels. Remember that the net contribution into Europe is about 10 billion a year. So again, it gives you a sense of the orders of magnitude. All of this is published on our website. You can find all of the results, and it's about 2.5 million jobs which are directly exposed. So of course, we're not saying what's going to happen, we're saying what the implications are. What are the impacts? Well, it depends on the supply responses, it depends what the negotiations broker. At the moment, we simply don't know, we can't say. What we can say is certain places are more exposed. In particular regions in the Midlands and the north of England, are they the ones which are the most resilient, that have the highest diversity of employment, the highest diversity of skills, they're able to best respond to global shocks? The evidence on productivity in the UK says absolutely no. The places which are the most resilient are the places which are the most prosperous. London and its hinterland, particularly in Scotland, followed. And these are the places which are actually facing the least levels of exposure. So we get the regional case that the core of the economy that voted Remain is less exposed than the places that voted Leave. And secondly, also, we see that in terms of the big city, small town story. The smaller towns and rural areas are also more exposed than the big cities. But it's a complicated set of relationships. It's region by region. And we have our results will explain kind of how we understand these things.
Phil, can you try
Okay.
the round up? Oh, this was no, great.
Okay.
Just in time. Thank you. I can imagine this raises some questions, but maybe we try to leave that for later on. Because I want to give the floor to Mr. Charlie Hopkirk, please.
Good morning. I'm from Black Country Consortium, and we essentially are sort of the delivery and strategic day-to-day for the Black Country Local Enterprise Partnership. So obviously not an academic unit or anything like that, but we have been quite heavily involved with the sort of Brexit process and trying to understand the concerns and the issues that Black Country businesses might be having, and basically where we can try and assist and help them, I guess. So I'll just quickly go through the context and then sort of just a little bit about how our Brexit group came together, and then just the findings that we've found from discussions with businesses. And then we've also put together a sort of asks document, which we sort of sent to the Department for Business in January. So I'll go through that as well. I won't delve too much into this, but obviously the Black Country Let, we work to stimulate economic development in the area, working across a range of sort of themes, sort of business, people and place more generally. And we've got an in-house intelligence team, so I'm a research analyst within that. So as I say, whilst not an academic team, we do have some research and analysis provision, mainly for the Black Country, but also for the West Midlands Combined Authority as well. So just to add to a bit of context of why the LEP wanted to dig deeper on the Brexit issue, without the obvious need to do so anyway, there's just some sort of headline statistics which show that the Black Country is quite heavily reliant on EU exports. So this, you probably won't be able to see it very well, but so it shows exports to, the Black Country, 60% of their exports go to the EU. I've also put Birmingham and Coventry on there as well, which are significantly lower. Compared to obviously the UK average of about 45%, potentially more reliant than some other areas. And similarly, you won't be able to see these at all, unfortunately, but just some research from some earlier research sort of a couple of years ago, well, not a couple of years ago, 18 months ago maybe, from KPMG. I think that one's University of Sussex, just showing the exposure. And Philip talked about this a minute ago on the sectoral basis. Oh, sorry, I've gone back. But just some key Black Country sectors such as metals, automotive manufacturing, even oil and gas and sort of industrial production. According to that research, we're heavily exposed to Brexit in terms of trade. And then again, I think this was more detailed on different situations, all of them showing a sort of negative output from the difference between exports now and post-Brexit in different scenarios, and some sectors worse than others. But significantly, some of the industries which are important in the Black Country, so a lot of the supply chain, metals manufacturing, that sort of thing. And moving on to the labour side of it, again, I think this is from the Manufacturing Association, showing the percentage of workers in manufacturing that are from the EU. West Midlands is at around 14%, which is about average for different regions, but substantial nonetheless. And then a sectoral basis here, again, you've got sort of metals, automotive manufacturing, at around 10%. 10% of workers are EU. So these sort of headline data was useful in the LEP thinking that they need to be proactive on this and sort of set up a sort of similar to the advisory group that Lloyd mentioned earlier, and just sort of understanding the concerns of business with the objective to sort of help in any way that they can. And just it sort of initially started with a round table in August 2017 where we brought some businesses together and basically just made it an open forum of tell us what you think about Brexit at the moment, how you think it's going to affect you, particular themes and that sort of thing, what their worries were, and then potential opportunities as well, of course. We selected from a cross-section of sectors, but focused a lot on manufacturing, as you could probably imagine, is natural in the Black Country with the roots there and everything like that. And we also tried to choose businesses that we knew had a high share of exports, particularly to the EU. So obviously, see what they thought the effect would be. And that was sort of supplemented by this document I put together, which, like the previous slides, just basically gave some of that context in terms of some of the headline data, which, although there isn't that much, we've just sort of rooted around and had a look at that. Ooh. And further discussions have sort of followed in the last year within the Brexit group with a sort of fluid membership structure. So we've had members that have been there the whole time, and we've spoke to different businesses as well. So that's sort of evolved into being more strategic and thinking about how we can sort of directly try and lobby the interests of the Black Country businesses. So we've been in partnership with the Black Country Chamber, and the Department for Business have also had people at the meetings as well. So basically got together sort of end of last year and thought, what can we actually do to try and put our points across rather than just talking about it, I guess. So in January, we sent a letter to Greg Clark, the Secretary of State for Business, along with a document of asks. So we had 8 asks, which we wanted to put across the sort of one business voice for the Black Country, essentially, on what we feel, the evidence we'd got, we could help in the post-Brexit period, I suppose. And I'll just take you through some of the findings from the discussions and then the asks themselves briefly. So they naturally fell into these sort of three categories, mainly trade and labour, obviously the key areas post-Brexit, and there's some stuff on funding as well. So this is trade. I don't know what's happened to the headings, but this is the trade bit. So the key thing that came out was the lack of certainty. I mean, it's obviously the key thing that businesses talk about is they think that they see themselves as adaptable to anything, but at least knowing what's going to happen, or at least some idea of what's going to happen. So that was really key. Maybe more worryingly, some businesses reported some hostility from EU customers, and that quote there sort of accentuates that. So since the referendum, some EU customers have discontinued their interest. We're quite surprised to hear that businesses from the EU were literally turning their back on some of the customers from the Midlands, and that's particular, as has been mentioned, the sort of supply chain and component manufacturing. So I think one of the key points was that some of the small sort of parts that go into all sorts of stuff, automotive, aerospace, all this sort of thing, many of them that are possibly made in the Black Country and other areas of the West Midlands, sort of unbranded and not protected, and with the sort of, I suppose, non-tariff barriers potentially could ensure they move to sort of other areas of the EU post-Brexit. So that was something which really came out. And then sort of on a different point, which probably just Brexit sort of focusing the mind on this sort of thing, is that there's not enough Department for International Trade advisors working locally, and they're not proactive enough, sort of reacting and not really doing enough. I think there's only sort of 5 or 6 in the whole, covering the whole of the Black Country, which isn't really good enough, according to the businesses. And all of these are sort of, we're more concerned with smaller firms that are obviously less knowledge and that sort of thing, and the ease of UK-EU trade just being taken for granted, really, more generally. There was some positive stuff in the short term around sort of low pound and a potential for sort of reshoring post-Brexit, but generally there was just a sort of urge of certainty and just knowing what was going to happen. It's an easy thing to say, but just that was what we were hearing. On labour, there was real concern around any reduction in EU workers. There was some sort of, again, surprising comments about the quality of UK workers compared to EU workers. That quote there sort of mentions that point about how important EU labour has been in the past decade. And I suppose there's a misconception in some areas around this being low-skilled labour, but we hear that's not the case at all, that the EU workers have been working across skill levels for many years. And yeah, generally there's a huge concern around the potential loss of that. And some businesses have already seen a trickle of EU workers leaving, which I think is coming out in the official statistics a bit more now. So these sort of generally pull up to that second point of the need for more assurances to be made on EU workers. I'm not sure whether anything recently has changed that, but I suppose we'll... Yeah, and then there's some more specific points about the immigration process, which I won't go into too much detail on that. And generally, there was just a real feeling of the country not doing enough to make EU citizens feel welcome, which is concerning for the business's workforce. And then, obviously, at the end, there's a bit more positivity of making it an opportunity for a more focused skills system, so focusing the mind on the UK skills system. Although, again, this is possibly more a long-term ambition. This is just the funding bit, which I'll just go through pretty quickly. Obviously, many projects in the Black Country and the wider West Midlands funded by structural funds in the past. There's some figures on there, so a few hundred million euros. Generally, the main concern was around the Prosperity Fund and whether that would actually reach the regions, or I don't know, but whether it would have the same effect as the structural funds. But again, opportunity-wise, there's a lot of criticism over the EU system for small business funding. So I suppose businesses were hoping that post-Brexit the UK government would be able to provide a more flexible, less bureaucratic system for business funding. Yeah, so I'll just... These were the asks that we sent to government. Just these four were on trade. So clarification, more certainty, smooth system, and then there was sort of providing guarantees over the rights, and then just basically some of them were quite general, some of them more specific than others. What we're doing next is hoping to get a roundtable session in Westminster with the Black Country Chamber, still providing that unified Black Country business voice, and also adding to the evidence base, which obviously today will be useful to hear what's said, and then just generally representing the Black Country businesses to hope for that seamless as possible transition post-Brexit. Sorry for the rush at the end.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sorry we have to rush on, but
It's all right.
it's actually good to hear all the stakeholders' voices. The next one is Mrs. Nicola Hewitt, West Midlands Growth Company. Yes.
Good morning. I work for the West Midlands Growth Company. We are the investment promotions agency. We work across the combined authority footprint, working in very close collaboration with the three LEPs of the area, as well as the local authorities. We work to promote the whole region, and specifically the cities, obviously, of Birmingham, Wolverhampton, and Coventry. My talk is slightly different to those that you've heard already, but hopefully it will be useful. When we talk about the investment promotions, we promote the city and the region and all of its nascent strengths. So when we go out and we promote the region and work with foreign-owned companies, both locally and then internationally, we look at promotion of our strongest sectors, which are obviously business and professional services, the technology and creative services, food and drink, and obviously automotive and advanced manufacturing, which would include rail and obviously aerospace. We also then work very closely with the LEPs to promote the growing and emerging sector strengths that we have in the region, which are life sciences, obviously, and low carbon technologies, specifically with regard to batteries and all of the innovation that's happening down with Warwick Manufacturing Group and Coventry. And when we promote the region, we promote very much on the things that make us different, and they are based very, very strongly on our population. So when you're promoting and competing internationally, you have to have a strong population and a certain size of population. So when you promote ourselves regionally, we can talk about 4.3 million, whereas if you talk with one of the particular cities, your region is very small. So that's therefore when you're promoting yourselves in, say, America or Germany or China, you need to have that density of population, hence why you need promotion on a regional footprint. So we promote the strength and the youth of the population, which is very important and of huge interest, that flow of talent to business. We also then leverage very, very strongly the R&D strengths of the area, as referenced by other speakers. And then we look at then things like cluster strength of businesses, as well as our fantastic quality of life. So when you take all of those things together, added into that the effects of the investment in infrastructure and the investment in the whole region coming out of the devolution, you realise that we actually, at the moment, have a very, very strong appeal. And a sort of testament to that is the fact that we've been incredibly successful with regard to attracting foreign businesses to come and invest here. Over the last 10 years, there have been over 971 projects. And of those, if I can just check my stats, between the USA, China and India, non-EU countries obviously, we had 336 projects, over 26,000 jobs. So that is very strong, and on the face of it looks very positive. However, below that, the second strongest nation is obviously Germany, as was shown by Philip's slides. And what is perhaps hidden underneath that as well is that our positioning until the vote was that obviously you would come and you would set up your businesses here because then we are the doorway into Europe. That premise has obviously been rocked fundamentally, and obviously the amount of uncertainty that has been created by the Brexit vote, and I'm surprised nobody's used the word uncertainty yet, but the amount of uncertainty created by that vote has fundamentally affected business, the way they're looking at their plans, and that has affected our flows of FDI immediately following that vote. So just before we talk about more direct effect of Brexit, I wanted to just put a little bit of a wider context into the discussion as well, because Brexit is not obviously the only thing happening, and when we're looking at investment and the opportunities for the region, we have to then look at also other wider, longer term economic impacts which are having as fundamental effects on our ability to attract investment as well as Brexit. So for us, these are things like the Internet of Things and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So if you think about IT and how there have been some huge and are continuing to be huge dramatic changes in IT, we have new startups, SMEs that are able to absolutely challenge huge global established players. If you think of the like of Uber, if you think of the likes of Instagram versus Kodak, we are seeing that IT and that disruptive technology is having a fundamental effect on the way service organizations are sort of structuring themselves, and that, historically whereby perhaps people would have put large groups of people in low-cost areas of the world, now with new disruptive IT technologies, that is no longer necessary, and that is no longer applicable for some large service organizations. So we are seeing that the way that big global companies are looking at their supply chains and footprints is fundamentally changing, and that a lot of that is being driven by IT and technological revolution. Also with large corporate organizations, when they are looking at setting up and looking at their global footprints, they're looking at doing a lot more collaborative research with very strong R&D clusters. So for us as a region, with the strength of our R&D institutions within this region, that is providing us with opportunities, because that is, big businesses are looking at R&D strengths and can they collaborate openly with clusters and R&D institutions. That is one of the key drivers of investment now, as well as cost of manufacture and labour, etc. So IT and R&D is a key driver, as well as Brexit. And then also, if you look at more widely sort of this fourth industrial revolution, obviously, the Internet of Things is affecting not only automotive, advanced manufacturing supply chains, it's affecting supply chains and the way businesses are set up across every single sector. And the slide, I've skipped one. The slide here sort of summarizes some of the changes that are happening with regard to those large global supply chains, and I'm sure David and Nigel are going to talk about these later. But what we're seeing is that actually, as people are looking at how they can become more proactive and perhaps have some more bespoke offers for more local markets, that is actually creating some development opportunities for us here in the West Midlands, irrespective of Brexit. So as people are moving to have perhaps supply chains located nearer their markets, with supply chains that have quite sophisticated technology and IT infrastructures. You know, if you think of our heritage in advanced manufacturing, innovation, IT, all of those things are actually going to be providing us with opportunities going forward, irrespective of the Brexit conversation. So I just wanted to highlight those things to say that yes, this whole seminar is about Brexit, but you have to put it into context of those wider economic changes as well. So if I move on more sort of directly to that whole Brexit question, we saw, with regard to the investors with whom we work very closely, that, you know, after the vote on the 23rd of June, we saw an immediate effect. So obviously the change in the pound value gave rise last summer to a huge amount of increased interest in capital investment, because people could get, quite frankly, more for their money. So we saw a huge amount of interest, and we saw huge, you know, interest in the region, you know, working with a team specifically at Birmingham City Council, Wahid Nazir. You know, we saw a lot of interest in China, the Middle East, America, all on those sort of, you know, value that they can get with Britain due to that drop in the rise in the pound, the diminution in the value of pound. But also on the flip side, on the negative side, you know, according to a recent survey from the Society of Motor Manufacturers and Traders in July 2017, last year, they sort of noted an immediate drop-off in investment. So in 2016, 1.66 billion was invested into the automotive sector, and actually that was 30% down than 2015, when 2.5 billion had been invested into the automotive sector. So you can see straight away there were some positives and there were negatives coming out of that Brexit vote, that the effects were pretty immediate. Just moving on to how it affects a range of the different industries. I know colleagues are going to talk about advanced manufacturing later, but you know, from our point of view, we work very closely with supply chains linked to advanced manufacturing. If you think, you know, your average life cycle for new product coming to the market is about 7 to 10 years. Really what we're seeing, that if investment decisions are not made now or are delayed over the next 12 months for those cyclical cycles of product development, that could have a long-term effect on job creation or job sustainability here within the region, and that is effectively affecting the supply chain day in, day out. So we are working with investors. We're trying to encourage them to come to the city, and they're saying, yeah, but you know, people haven't made their decision yet. That investment isn't coming through yet, and that affects all levels of that advanced manufacturing, from rail, automotive, etc. If you then look a little bit more closely at consumer manufacturing, consumer manufacturing over there on the right, you know, they obviously, their product development cycles aren't so large. They're much shorter product development cycles. But for them, the big issue that they are facing is the supply of labour. So the questions that are being raised by Brexit, all in and around labour supply, again, that is making companies, they don't like the uncertainty. What will their labour supply be? Should they invest in Britain? Should they make that capital investment in that new product here in the West Midlands and in the UK? Or should they actually decide to put it in a European country where they know what's happening? So again, these questions and the uncertainty created by Brexit is definitely having an impact on flows of FDI immediately into the region that we have seen in the last sort of year and a half. With regards to financial services, that's not so dark. Again, was referenced by Philip. There are some opportunities there with us in relation to people looking at reworking their supply chain footprints as a lower cost region to London. There are opportunities as well as risks. And then, you know, there are wider implications with regard to the uncertainty created how VAT, exports, all of these things are making businesses pause to think, actually, will they make their investment here in the region? And I don't really want to, you know, there are some opportunities coming out of it, but it is very difficult, and I don't want to sort of play down the risks So we are trying to promote the nascent strengths of the region, the nascent strengths of the combined authority, and I think our strength in innovation and talent will be the things that will help us combat some of the potential negatives linked to that uncertainty of the Brexit decision. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was very informative. We move on to David Hearn, Birmingham City University and Brexit Studies.
I'm here on behalf of the Centre for Brexit Studies at Birmingham City University. The centre was set up just over a year ago under the leadership of Professor Alex de Ruyter. And essentially the aim of the centre is to bring together expertise from across the university and, where applicable, from our academic and commercial partners as well outside. And today I would like to speak about one particular project that we've undertaken. And I have three real objectives in terms of my talk today. First of all, I'd like to introduce and briefly explain some of the work we've done in the project. Secondly, I would like to demonstrate that it has direct policy relevance, particularly in terms of shared prosperity funding and in terms of the end of EU funding flows. And thirdly, I'd like to show that it feeds into and reinforces the importance of the central piece of work that our colleagues at City-REDI have introduced today, that is discussing the sectors and regional impact of Brexit, and how, if anything, our work just reinforces and reiterates how important dealing with that will be. So the centre of our work has essentially been developing a series of regional price levels. Now, this sounds quite esoteric and perhaps a little bit boring, but the theoretical rationale and underpinning for this is clearly very important, because when measuring regional living standards, regional wages, gross disposable household income, and indeed gross value added, it's important to take account not just of the amounts in pounds and pence, but also how much things cost, the price level. Your standard of living depends as much on your cost of living as it does on your wage. So we've developed a sort of series of consumer price levels based primarily on ONS data. We've brought together a number of data sources, and we've tried to use the methodology used by the Eurostat OECD. So we've used the EKS method, which I would defend as probably the gold standard in international purchasing power parity comparisons. And really what our numbers show is, unsurprisingly I suppose, that prices are significantly higher in London and the surrounding regions, particularly the southeast. We've got lower and upper bounds, primarily because how you account for housing costs can differ. So exactly which data source you use to measure different housing costs, and the appropriate measure here is rents, both actual rents and imputed rents, in terms of measuring consumer prices of housing. But we can see that regardless of the precise data source used, London is a considerably more expensive place to live than any other part of the UK, and the north in particular comes in much cheaper. The West Midlands is somewhere between the two, and I will point out that has quite important ramifications for gross disposable household income. So, drawing in fact on the work of Professor McCann, we follow the argument that the direction of travel, the direction of causality, if you like, runs from regional to urban rather than the other way around. In other words, the comparative performance of cities in the UK is to a significant extent defined by their sort of performance of the surrounding regions. So again, we've got, I don't know if it's visible on this slide, but gross value added per capita is somewhere up here in the case of London, and somewhere down here in the case of Yorkshire. And what we're essentially arguing is that gross value added per capita is an extremely poor measure to use when allocating regional funding flows. So one of the most interesting things that comes out of this is that if you look at individual city regions, the West Midlands Combined Authority area has the lowest disposable household income per capita by a significant margin, bar none. It's around 10% poorer than the second poorest region in the UK, namely South Yorkshire. That has important ramifications in terms of funding, because I think that gives you an extremely strong argument if you are looking for a greater share of any future shared prosperity fund. I think that has direct policy relevance. Also, there's a very interesting set of arguments to be made by sub-regions within London, because although, yes, they have relatively high average incomes, they also have very, very high price levels, so their real incomes look much lower than their nominal counterparts. So I would make the argument that this has direct policy relevance for any attempt to look at regional development funding, and that it's important in shaping the nature of regional development funding. In particular, we find that South Wales is no worse off than South Yorkshire. So those who remember the court case a few years ago, where I believe the European Commission was taken to court over ERDF funding and ESA funding, we'll note that with some interest, I think. Moving on to the impact on gross value added, these are very much experimental statistics in their current stage. We're working quite hard on trying to put together the most robust data sources. It's quite difficult to get full purchasing power parities, primarily because it's quite difficult to ascertain figures in terms of looking at the cost of delivering government services in various regions and the cost of gross fixed capital formation. So these figures are subject to change. I think we can have a degree of confidence in our lower bound that this effect will not be smaller, this relative price effect will not be smaller in terms of its GVA impact than our lower bound suggests. And when you apply these deflators to gross value added, productivity specifically, so that's gross value added per hour worked across the government office regions, NUTS1 sub-regions technically, in the UK, these are the figures that we end up with. And again, the impact is fairly predictable, I suppose. What we see is that regions in the north experience an uplift in their relative productivity. London and the southeast experience a fall. One of the most interesting things that jumps out at me anyway is devolution works. Devolution works. If you look at the figures for Scotland, Scotland actually overtakes the southeast in terms of its productivity, in terms of its real productivity levels when you adjust for prices. Scotland is a relatively productive part of the UK. Its productivity levels jump from below to above the national average. The same is true for Wales. Wales goes from being by far the least productive part of the UK to roughly on a par with its English counterparts, its counterparts in the north of England. So I would argue this is strong evidence that devolution really does work, and there's a strong argument to be made for greater levels of devolution, both for regions and for cities in the UK. Finally, I would argue that a corollary of this is that in terms of purchasing power adjusted gross value added, the importance of these regions in the North and Midlands have been understated by nominal figures. The impact of that is that if this is true, then it reinforces the importance done by the work of City-REDI, because it suggests that these regions, which are going to be hit particularly hard by Brexit, are more important to the overall national wealth than has been shown so far in official data. So I would argue that not only does this have very real ramifications for funding flows, for any future shared prosperity fund and for any arguments over devolution, but it also has very real ramifications in terms of supporting the work done by our colleagues, because it suggests that these regions, which have hitherto been argued as being perhaps less important than the City of London, for example, are quite the opposite. They make a significant, and particularly when you add up the effect for this region, across the UK, you'll find that these make a significantly greater portion of total UK output than official figures suggest. The upshot being that it's really, really important to get this right. And on that note, I think I'll finish. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Hoping that we still had the full hour, I think we still have some time for questions. Still, the questions are to be asked into a microphone, so I don't know if someone is carrying around one. Otherwise, I try to toss one, but please.
Good morning. So as we were asked before, I'm going to start with introducing myself. My name is Violaine Mendes. I am French, and I work here in a small company in Birmingham. I have a PhD in chemistry, and I'm working in a research and development lab to make some specialist coatings. So we work with people like Rolls-Royce and Siemens. And so my question, first of all, is, do any of you consider that maybe we shouldn't go through with Brexit? Someone had to ask it.
Philip?
The reality is these things are an outcome of political processes.
I'm Ken Key. I'm an interested bystander. But a simple question. To me, it makes no sense whatsoever to travel thousands of kilometres when we can travel hundreds to the EU and back again. I used to be an environmental services engineer, designing services in buildings, and the carbon footprint was something we kept hearing about. The carbon footprint of travel, 10 times more than we necessarily need to, seems to me completely farcical. So I would argue that, you know, it would be a great idea if we didn't leave.
Well, a couple of things. Obviously, in a democratic parliamentary process, the outcomes are dependent on the parliamentary system. And we don't know how this is going to evolve. We assume Brexit's going to happen, but the form of Brexit is the key thing. And at the moment, everything is fluid. So we don't know how these things are going to evolve. The point about distance is important. Yes, the carbon footprint, of course, is an argument that many people have talked about. But actually, more generally, to do with the structure of trade that we've been working on, one of the arguments is that we're now in a post-geographical trading environment. We've heard these phrases. Yet the literature on international trade and economic geography is just overwhelmingly 99.9% against that argument. It simply says it isn't true. While the cost of distance have fallen in the last decades dramatically through containerization, GPS systems, low-cost airlines, advanced container shipping and so on, enormous improvements in aircraft technology, the point is that the cost of time have increased. I mean, people don't want things sitting on a container for months before it's delivered. They don't want things frozen, traveling thousands of miles. They want things fresh. People's preferences have changed. So actually, there's a huge amount of evidence in international trade that shows actually, ironically, since the world has become cheaper to travel, that the cost of distance have actually increased in the last 30 years. And there's an enormous amount of distance, and it's in every industry. It's in services, people want things faster. In manufacturing, engineering, you want things customized very, very fast. So the distance argument is actually, from an economic geography point of view, the distance has actually become bigger. And what you see is our simulations that we've already done, again, we've published this already, is that all of the regions in the UK since the millennium have become more integrated with Europe. The only region that hasn't, that's fallen, of course, is Greater London, because London has become hyper-globalized. It's less dependent on Europe than anywhere else, whereas the rest of the UK regions have become even more integrated in Europe. So the idea that geography is dead, I mean, we've heard this before. There's been multiple predictions of this in 1992. O'Brien Council of Presidents' Foreign Advisors on Trade, in 1997, the famous book, Francis Cairncroft, The Death of Distance, 2004, 2005, Thomas Frieden, The World is Flat. I mean, these books are a great read, but they're all rubbish. I mean, the empirics just say the complete opposite. And so we are in a difficult position. If you look at the idea of doing trade deals with other countries, well, there are some effects that will come from these things, but basically all of the evidence shows that they can't compensate for any negative effects of trade. And the way to think about it is an economy like China is gigantic, but its effects on the UK economy are about the size of the Newcastle city economy. The economy of Newcastle is about the size of the kind of urban area of Newcastle. It's about the size of the contribution of the Chinese economy to the UK. Countries like China, countries like Canada, Australia, they're about the size of places like Leicester. And countries like New Zealand would be about the size of places like Mansfield or Chesterfield. So even a big economy like Canada is really somewhere between Bournemouth and Leicester. So, if you imagine have a free trade deal increases trade by 10%, you're talking about a suburban neighbourhood of Bournemouth. That's the contribution. I mean, these are incredibly marginal, and all these results come out in the World Impact Output database. So in international trade, these are well known. So the geography argument is, really a non-argument. So it's a matter of how to respond to and cope with the structural changes that will come out of the deliberative and democratic processes within the parliamentary system. And so we basically have to wait and see.
Okay, thank you. One more question? Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, it follows on from what you were saying about trading components, nipping back and forth. There was some minister on the radio saying, look at Toyota, they get lots of their stuff from the Far East. They have no problem with not having a trade deal, with the Far East not having a trade deal with the EU. Could you just explain what he was on about and how that compares with what you've been finding in terms of the flitting back and forth of components and bits and pieces and how that would be affected?
Well, the Toyota case, for example, only a small minority of their products come from the Far East. The vast majority, more than 60%, come within the European Union. That's also because they have to comply with the rules of the EU. They have large amounts of local components, but the majority are coming, and particularly the higher value-added components, are coming from other parts of the EU. That's how they work, because they run on what are called just-in-time systems. So a company like Honda, for example, will have 350, is it, shipments a day? They've got less than half an hour inventory, and those shipments are changing every day. What's in each container is changing because the production schedules on the plant, the production line, are changing daily according to orders. So the idea of, that, for example, you can monitor what's inside, these shipments via number plate recognition. These are components coming which are changing every day from all over different parts of Europe. I mean, this is just how they work. The problem is, how do you continue to run those systems in a situation where we're coming out of the customs union? So what kind of customs partnership can still allow those systems to work? Because the way the systems work is because they have zero checks. That's the reality. It's not small. It's zero. It's the only way those systems work. Actually, Greg Clark, the Minister for Business, was talking about this on Sunday. I think it was on Andrew Marr. And his points are well made about that. So again, it depends what details come out in the negotiated agreements, what actually happens. It's all in the detail. And small changes in detail can have enormous changes in terms of the production logic of these organizations.
Okay, I asked the person in the yellow tie to keep it up for after the break. Is that it?
Very briefly.
Or very briefly then.
I run a translations company and represent a money transfer service, and the economic impacts are huge for me. However, I'm more bothered about the social impact. What's going to happen to VLN's baby? What's their citizenship? Where do we stand as these are human lives at stake, and are we going to have another Windrush scandal in a few years?
Well, that's a big point. I think we have to take it from here further on. I will keep this in mind, if you don't mind. We're halfway the day, so maybe further on the day we can get some more answers to Mr. Broad's questions, which were raised at the beginning. I hope to see you back after the break. I will remember your question. Maybe I can answer it a bit later on. I don't promise it. Let's first have a coffee break before the coffee gets too cold. Thank you.